Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, but something's wrong. The world outside your window isn't the safe, comfortable reality you know. Instead, you're standing in the middle of humanity's most brutal survival test, where a single wrong decision doesn't just ruin your day. It ends your life permanently. Today we're diving deep into the 4 deadliest periods in human history. Eras so dangerous that most people who lived through them didn't. We're talking about times when your morning routine could include dodging 20-foot crocodiles, when a simple cut could kill you in days, and when entire civilizations collapsed because the weather changed. By the end of this journey, you'll discover whether you have what it takes to survive when death lurks around every corner. But before we begin this terrifying expedition through time, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy content that pushes the boundaries of human survival. And let me know in the comments which historical period scares you the most. Now let's see if you have what it takes to survive the ultimate test of human endurance. Our first stop takes us back 24,000 years to the last glacial maximum, when massive ice sheets stretched across continents and early humans faced the ultimate survival challenge. This wasn't just cold weather. This was an apocalyptic freeze that transformed the entire planet into a hostile wasteland, where temperatures plummeted to levels that would make modern Arctic expeditions look like summer vacations. The numbers alone should terrify you. During this period, our ancestors needed between 3,300 and 4,400 calories per day just to survive the brutal cold. That's nearly double what most people consume today, and every single calorie had to be earned through backbreaking labor in conditions that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. Finding those calories meant hunting massive, dangerous animals with nothing but stone-tipped spears and your wits. Imagine stalking a woolly mammoth that stands 12 feet tall and weighs 6 tons, knowing that your survival depends on getting close enough to drive a spear into its hide, while it's very much alive and very much capable of crushing you like an insect. The hunting strategies our ancestors developed were ingenious, but absolutely terrifying to execute. At sites like Roche de Saint-Loutre in eastern France, Ice Age hunters would build massive fires twice a year to corral migrating herds of wild horses and reindeer into narrow valleys. Picture this coordinated slaughter, where hundreds of panicked animals stampeded through bottlenecks while hunters waited with primitive weapons, knowing that failure meant starvation for their entire tribe. Archaeological evidence shows this systematic hunting continued for tens of thousands of years. But what the evidence can't capture is the constant terror these people lived with. Every hunt was a potential death sentence. One slip on icy ground, one miscalculation of an animal's speed, one moment of hesitation, and you became the prey instead of the predator. The shelter situation was equally desperate. Forget about running indoors when the temperature dropped. Your indoor shelter was a hole partially dug into the frozen earth. Framed with mammoth bones, you either hunted yourself or scavenged from rotting carcasses. These dome-shaped structures were covered with animal hides and sod, creating a makeshift barrier against winds that could literally kill you in minutes of exposure. During the brief summer months, temperatures still dropped below freezing at night, which means there was never a moment of true safety from the cold. Your clothing was made from animal skins you had to hunt, process, and sew together using bone needles, because synthetic fabrics wouldn't exist for another 20,000 years. One tear in your clothing during a hunt could mean hypothermia and death before you made it back to shelter. But the cold was just one threat in an endless list of dangers. Climate fluctuations during the Ice Age were incredibly violent and unpredictable. The planet oscillated between cold and colder with terrifying frequency, and these changes could happen rapidly enough to destroy entire food sources within a generation. Population studies reveal just how close our species came to extinction during this period. In Europe, the human population crashed to somewhere between 5,000 and 130,000 people across the entire continent. Think about that for a moment. The entire European human population could have fit inside a modern football stadium, and they were scattered across millions of square miles of frozen wasteland. These weren't just statistics. These were real people watching their friends, families, and entire communities disappear as the climate became increasingly hostile. The psychological pressure of knowing that humanity itself hung by a thread must have been crushing, yet somehow our ancestors found the mental strength to keep fighting for survival. Tool making became a matter of life and death during this period. The sophisticated stone tools, bone needles, and hunting weapons that archaeologists have discovered weren't just clever inventions. They were the difference between living another day and becoming food for scavengers. Creating these tools required incredible skill and knowledge that had to be passed down through oral tradition, because losing that knowledge meant losing the ability to survive. The development of clothing during this period shows just how desperate the situation became. Humans created the first fitted garments around 45,000 years ago, not for fashion, but because loose-fitting animal skins simply weren't enough protection against the killing cold. The invention of the needle between 20 and 30,000 years ago revolutionized survival, allowing people to create weatherproof clothing that could mean the difference between life and death. But even with all these innovations, the margin for error was essentially zero. Lose your tools and you couldn't hunt effectively. Damage your clothing and you faced exposure. Run out of stored food during winter and starvation beckoned. Get injured during a hunt and there was no medical care to save you. Every day was a series of life or death decisions with no room for mistakes. The social dynamics of survival during the Ice Age created additional pressures that modern humans can barely comprehend. Small groups of people had to work together flawlessly because there was no backup plan. Arguments or personality conflicts weren't just inconvenient. They could doom an entire group to starvation or death by exposure. Resource management became a constant source of tension and anxiety. How much stored meat should be consumed now versus saved for later? Who gets the warmest spot by the fire during the coldest nights? These weren't casual decisions. They were literally matters of life and death that had to be made while struggling against hunger, cold, and the constant threat of predators. The predator situation during the Ice Age was absolutely nightmarish. Cave bears, saber-toothed cats, and massive wolves shared the landscape with early humans, and they were all competing for the same limited resources. These weren't the domesticated animals we know today. These were apex predators that viewed humans as potential prey, not the dominant species we would eventually become. Even sleep became dangerous during the Ice Age. Maintaining fires throughout the night was essential for survival, which meant someone had to stay awake to tend the flames. Fall asleep and wake up to find your fire dead, and you might not live to see morning. The constant sleep deprivation from rotating watch duties would have worn down people's physical and mental health, making them more vulnerable to accidents and poor decisions. The seasonal migrations required by Ice Age survival created their own set of terrifying challenges. Groups had to move across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, carrying everything they owned while navigating by landmarks that could be obscured by storms or changed by geological activity. Getting lost during migration meant certain death, either from exposure, starvation, or predation. Food storage and preservation techniques had to be perfected through trial and error, with failure meaning starvation. Smoking meat, creating fat reserves, and finding ways to keep food from spoiling in primitive conditions required knowledge that took generations to develop. The people who figured out these techniques survived. Those who didn't became evolutionary dead ends. The psychological toll of Ice Age survival is almost impossible to imagine. Living with the constant knowledge that death could come at any moment, watching children die from exposure or starvation, losing friends and family members to hunting accidents or predator attacks. The mental strength required to keep fighting for survival under these conditions demonstrates incredible human resilience, but it came at an enormous psychological cost. As we prepare to leave the frozen wasteland of the Ice Age behind, remember that every person alive today carries the genetic legacy of ancestors who survived these impossible conditions. They endured so that we could exist, but their survival came at a price that modern humans can barely comprehend. The Ice Age wasn't just cold weather and primitive tools. It was humanity's first great test, and the fact that we passed it proves that survival is built into our very DNA. But surviving the Ice Age was just the beginning of humanity's struggle against hostile environments and deadly conditions. As the ice sheets retreated and civilizations began to emerge, new dangers arose that would challenge human survival in completely different ways. Our next destination transports us to a land that seems like paradise compared to the frozen hell we just escaped. Ancient Egypt, with its golden pyramids and mighty Nile, appears to offer refuge from the brutal conditions our ancestors endured. But this apparent oasis hides dangers so insidious and varied that your chances of reaching your 30th birthday were barely 50%. Welcome to a civilization where life expectancy averaged just 25 years at birth, and where the very river that gave life to an entire culture could kill you in dozens of different ways. The Nile wasn't just Egypt's lifeline. It was a liquid highway of death that claimed victims through disease, predators, and environmental hazards that turned daily survival into a deadly gamble. Let's start with the most immediate threat lurking beneath those supposedly life-giving waters. Crocodiles in ancient Egypt weren't the relatively manageable creatures you might see in modern zoos. These were massive apex predators, some reaching lengths of over 20 feet, with jaws powerful enough to snap human bones like twigs. During flood season, when the Nile expanded its borders, these killing machines spread throughout the countryside, turning simple tasks like collecting water or washing clothes into potentially fatal encounters. But crocodiles were just the beginning of your aquatic nightmares. Hippos, despite their deceptively docile appearance, were responsible for more human deaths than any other large animal in ancient Africa. These 4-ton behemoths could run faster than humans on land and were incredibly territorial in water. A single bite from a hippo could easily sever a human torso, and their unpredictable nature meant that even experienced Egyptians never felt completely safe around water sources. The water itself carried invisible killers that were perhaps even more dangerous than the large predators. Schistosomiasis parasites lived in the Nile's waters, entering human bodies through the skin during routine activities like bathing or farming. These microscopic invaders would systematically destroy internal organs, causing chronic pain, liver damage, and eventually death. Archaeological evidence shows that virtually every ancient Egyptian who lived near the Nile carried these parasites, making debilitating illness a universal condition rather than an unfortunate exception. Malaria added another layer of deadly complexity to Egyptian survival. The mosquitoes that bred in Nile floodwaters carried malaria parasites that could kill healthy adults within days. Unlike modern malaria treatments, ancient Egyptians had no effective remedies beyond prayer and primitive herbal concoctions that rarely worked. Entire communities could be decimated by malaria outbreaks, particularly during flood seasons when mosquito populations exploded. The physical demands of Egyptian life created their own category of survival challenges. Workers building pyramids, temples, and irrigation systems faced back-breaking labor that systematically destroyed their bodies. Archaeological analysis of worker skeletons reveals spines compressed from carrying massive stone blocks, joints worn down from repetitive motions, and bones fractured from construction accidents. The grit and sand from stone ground flour abraded teeth down to the roots, creating abscesses that could spread infection throughout the body and kill otherwise healthy individuals. Egyptian society's gender dynamics created specific survival challenges that affected men and women differently, but equally lethally. Women faced the terrifying prospect of childbirth without any modern medical intervention. Maternal mortality rates were staggering, with many women writing final wills before giving birth because they understood the very real possibility of death during labour. Breech births, prolonged labour, and postpartum infections killed countless mothers, while those who survived often faced repeated pregnancies that weakened their bodies and increased the likelihood of death with each subsequent birth. Men, meanwhile, faced occupational hazards that were statistically just as deadly. Military service meant potential death in battle, but also exposure to diseases carried by foreign armies and the constant threat of injury from primitive weapons. Quarry workers faced cave-ins, crushing injuries from massive stones, and lung diseases from breathing stone dust. Even relatively safe occupations like farming carried risks from agricultural accidents, animal attacks, and the ever-present threat of Nile-related dangers. The diet that sustained Egyptian civilization also carried hidden dangers that could kill you slowly or quickly, depending on your social status. Wealthy Egyptians consumed sugar-rich foods that promoted severe dental problems and periodontal disease. Archaeological evidence shows that elite Egyptian mummies often suffered from advanced tooth decay and gum infections that would have caused excruciating pain and potentially fatal systemic infections. Poor Egyptians, meanwhile, faced malnutrition and starvation whenever harvests failed or political instability disrupted food distribution systems. Child mortality in ancient Egypt reached levels that would horrify modern parents. Approximately 1/3 of all children died before reaching their 5th birthday, victims of diseases that are easily preventable today. Diarrheal illnesses, respiratory infections, and parasitic diseases claimed young lives with ruthless efficiency. Even children who survived infancy faced constant threats from accidents, animal attacks, and the same environmental hazards that killed adults. The political landscape of ancient Egypt created additional survival challenges that could destroy lives and entire communities with terrifying speed. Foreign invasions brought warfare, displacement, and the breakdown of social systems that people depended on for survival. When Assyrians invaded Egypt in 671 BCE, they didn't just conquer territory, they systematically destroyed infrastructure, disrupted trade routes, and imposed taxation systems that pushed many Egyptians to the brink of starvation. Desert expeditions, necessary for trade and resource extraction, represented some of the most dangerous activities in ancient Egypt. Travelers faced scorching daytime temperatures that could cause fatal heat stroke, freezing nighttime conditions that could kill through exposure, and sandstorms that could blind, disorient, and separate people from their water supplies. Navigation errors in the desert meant certain death, either from dehydration, exposure, or attacks by desert nomads who viewed Egyptian expeditions as opportunities for raids and plunder. The medical treatments available to ancient Egyptians often caused more harm than the original ailments they were meant to address. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia or antiseptic conditions, leading to shock, infection, and death rates that made avoiding medical treatment often the safer option. Even successful surgeries frequently resulted in secondary infections that killed patients weeks or months after apparently successful procedures. Religious and cultural practices sometimes created their own survival hazards. The mummification process, while spiritually important, required handling of toxic substances and exposure to diseases from decomposing bodies. Workers in mummification facilities faced constant exposure to chemical preservatives and infectious agents that could cause respiratory problems, skin conditions, and systemic poisoning. Even participation in religious festivals could be dangerous, as large crowds created opportunities for disease transmission, accidents, and occasionally violence. The seasonal flooding of the Nile, essential for Egyptian agriculture, created annual periods of heightened danger that affected entire populations. Floodwaters brought not just fertile soil, but also increased populations of dangerous animals, disease-carrying insects, and contaminated water that spread illness throughout communities. Predicting flood levels was crucial for survival, but ancient Egyptians had no reliable methods for forecasting, meaning that communities could be caught unprepared by either devastating floods or insufficient water for crops. Egyptian housing conditions created additional health hazards that modern people would find unimaginable. Poor ventilation in mud brick homes led to respiratory problems from cooking smoke and dust. Shared living spaces facilitated disease transmission between family members. Inadequate waste disposal systems created breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and contaminated water sources. Even wealthy Egyptian homes, while more comfortable, were not immune to structural failures, fires, and pest infestations that could threaten inhabitants' health and safety. The preservation of food in Egypt's hot climate required techniques that carried their own risks. Improperly preserved meat could harbour deadly bacteria that caused food poisoning. Grain storage attracted rodents that carried diseases and contaminated food supplies. Salt preservation, while effective, required access to salt sources that might be controlled by hostile groups or located in dangerous areas. Failure to properly preserve food during abundant harvests meant potential starvation during lean periods. As we prepare to leave ancient Egypt behind and journey to our next deadly destination, it's important to understand that this civilization, for all its remarkable achievements, was built on foundations of constant danger and premature death. The pyramids and temples that still inspire wonder today were constructed by people who lived with the daily knowledge that survival was never guaranteed, and death could come from countless directions without warning. The Egyptians developed remarkable technologies, medical knowledge and social systems, but none of these innovations could fully protect them from the fundamental hostility of their environment. Every Egyptian who lived to old age had survived not just the passage of time, but a gauntlet of deadly threats that claimed the majority of their contemporaries before their prime years. But even the dangers of ancient Egypt pale in comparison to our next destination, where urban civilization created entirely new categories of deadly threats that would test human survival in ways our species had never before experienced. Our journey now takes us to the height of human civilization, where marble columns reached toward the heavens and aqueducts carried fresh water across impossible distances. Welcome to the Roman Empire, where citizens enjoyed luxuries that wouldn't be seen again for over 1,000 years. But beneath the gleaming facade of imperial grandeur lurked an urban nightmare that made survival more precarious than ever before. You might think that advanced civilization would make life safer, but you'd be catastrophically wrong. Life expectancy in Roman cities actually dropped to around 27 years, shorter than what people experienced in prehistoric times. The very innovations that made Rome great, massive urban populations, complex trade networks, advanced architecture, also created entirely new ways to die that our species had never encountered before. Let's start with what historians call the 6 deadly threats of Roman urban life: floods, fires, famines, footpads, filth, and fevers. These weren't occasional disasters. They were constant companions that stalked every Roman citizen from birth to their typically early grave. Living in Rome meant accepting that any of these threats could kill you on any given day, regardless of your social status or wealth. The flooding situation alone should terrify you. Rome was built in a low-lying area near the Tiber River, which meant that heavy rains could turn the city into a death trap within hours. When floods struck, they didn't just damage property, they contaminated water supplies, destroyed food stores, and created breeding grounds for disease that could kill thousands of people in the aftermath. The wealthy might escape to higher ground, but the poor were trapped in tenement buildings that became watery tombs. Fire presented an even more immediate and terrifying threat. Roman apartment buildings, called insulae, were essentially vertical death traps constructed from wood and other flammable materials. These structures could reach 6 or 7 stories high, packed with families living in cramped conditions with open flames for cooking and heating. When fires started, they spread with devastating speed through entire neighborhoods, trapping residents in buildings with inadequate exits and no organized firefighting services. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the most famous example of an ongoing threat that killed Romans regularly. Archaeological evidence shows that major fires swept through different sections of the city every few years, destroying entire districts and killing hundreds or thousands of residents who had no escape routes from their burning homes. But surviving floods and fires was just the beginning of your Roman survival challenge. The city's massive population, estimated at over 1 million people at its peak, created sanitation problems that would horrify modern urban planners. Human waste, garbage, and animal remains accumulated in streets faster than they could be removed, creating a toxic environment that bred disease and attracted deadly pests. The famous Roman sewer system, while advanced for its time, served only a fraction of the population. Most residents relied on public latrines that were shared by hundreds of people and rarely cleaned properly. These facilities became epicenters of disease transmission, where sitting down to relieve yourself could expose you to deadly infections from previous users. Privacy was non-existent, hygiene was minimal, and the risk of contracting fatal illnesses was enormous. Roman medical treatment, despite some genuine advances, remained more dangerous than helpful for most conditions. Surgical procedures were performed without proper sterilization, anesthesia, or understanding of infection control. Doctors reused instruments between patients, spreading disease from one victim to the next. The mortality rate from surgical procedures was so high that many Romans chose to endure painful conditions rather than risk medical intervention. Broken bones were common in Roman society due to dangerous working conditions, but the treatment methods were primitive and often fatal. Instead of modern techniques for setting bones, Roman physicians simply placed wooden cages over damaged limbs and hoped the bones would heal themselves properly. These crude splints often resulted in permanent disability, chronic pain, and secondary infections that could kill patients months after their initial injuries. The working conditions that created so many injuries were themselves a constant threat to survival. Recent archaeological analysis of Roman skeletons reveals the brutal reality of daily labor in the empire. Broken noses, shattered hand bones, and fractured collarbones were commonplace injuries that workers simply had to endure. Construction workers carried massive stones that compressed their spines and destroyed their joints. Manual laborers developed severe arthritis from repetitive motions that gradually crippled their bodies. The research paints a horrifying picture of Roman working life. People were generally dead before 30, their bodies riddled with arthritis and covered with evidence of traumatic injuries. The harsh realities of imperial Rome were revealed through modern scanning techniques applied to thousands of ancient skeletons, showing that most Romans lived in constant pain from work-related injuries that never healed properly. Disease outbreaks in Roman cities were catastrophic events that could kill significant portions of the population within months. The dense urban environment provided perfect conditions for epidemics to spread rapidly through entire districts. Estimates suggest that major plague outbreaks killed between 10 and 33% of the empire's total population, with death rates reaching 15% in cities where conditions were most crowded. The Antonine Plague, which struck the empire in the 2nd century, demonstrates just how vulnerable Roman civilization was to disease. Contemporary historians recorded up to 2,000 deaths per day in the city of Rome alone during the worst periods of the outbreak. 25% of people who contracted the disease died, and the total death count has been estimated at 5 to 10 million people across the entire empire. These weren't quick deaths from acute illnesses. Many diseases caused prolonged suffering that could last for weeks or months before finally claiming their victims. Dysentery, typhoid, and other intestinal diseases caused excruciating pain and gradual weakening that made victims vulnerable to secondary infections. Malaria, spread by mosquitoes breeding in Rome's marshy surroundings, caused recurring fever cycles that slowly destroyed people's health over multiple episodes. Parasitic infections were actually more common in Roman cities than they had been in earlier, less developed settlements. The advanced Roman lifestyle, with its public baths, shared facilities, and complex food distribution systems, created new opportunities for parasites to spread between hosts. Intestinal worms, lice, and other parasitic organisms found ideal conditions in Roman urban environments, where they could easily move from person to person through contaminated water, shared spaces, and close living quarters. The housing situation for most Romans was a nightmare that combined multiple deadly threats into a single living environment. Tenement buildings were overcrowded, structurally unsound, and extremely dangerous places to live. Most residents faced constant fear of fires, building collapses, crime and disease transmission from their immediate neighbours. The jobs that brought people to these urban death traps were often unavailable, creating epidemics of homelessness and forcing people to live in even more dangerous conditions on the streets. Food safety in Roman cities was a constant gamble with potentially fatal consequences. Complex trade routes brought food from across the empire, but preservation and transportation methods were primitive by modern standards. Grain could become contaminated with deadly fungi during storage or transport, causing ergot poisoning that led to convulsions, hallucinations, and death. Meat and dairy products spoiled quickly in warm climates, harboring bacteria that caused severe food poisoning. The Roman diet, while varied and sophisticated compared to earlier periods, carried hidden dangers that could kill you slowly or quickly, depending on your luck. Lead pipes, used in water systems, gradually poisoned the population through chronic exposure to heavy metals. Wine, a staple beverage, was often contaminated with lead from the vessels used in its production and storage. Even wealthy Romans, who could afford the best food and drink, were slowly being poisoned by the very infrastructure that supported their lifestyle. Political violence was an ever-present threat that could destroy lives without warning. The assassination rate among Roman emperors was extraordinarily high, with 62% dying violent deaths from murder, suicide, or battle. If the most protected people in the empire faced such dangers, ordinary citizens were completely vulnerable to political upheavals that could result in mass executions, property confiscations, and forced relocations. The first year of any emperor's rule was particularly dangerous for everyone in the empire, as new rulers often consolidated power through violence and purges of potential opponents. Political instability created economic chaos that disrupted food supplies, trade routes, and social services that people depended on for survival. Civil wars could turn formerly safe neighborhoods into battlefields overnight, trapping civilians between competing armies that showed little concern for non-combatant casualties. Economic crises in the Roman Empire created widespread social chaos that made simple daily life dangerous for everyone. When trade routes were disrupted, food became scarce and expensive, leading to riots and social unrest that could turn deadly without warning. Only residents of the capital had reliable access to basic supplies, while people in outlying areas faced starvation and desperation that drove them to increasingly dangerous behaviors. The social infrastructure that Romans depended on for daily life was itself a source of constant danger. Public baths, while luxurious, were breeding grounds for skin diseases and infections that spread rapidly through shared water. Public toilets were sites of disease transmission where users faced exposure to dangerous bacteria and parasites. Community spaces that brought people together also facilitated the spread of illnesses that could kill entire families within weeks. Military service, mandatory for many Roman men, carried obvious dangers from combat, but also exposed soldiers to diseases from foreign lands inadequate medical care in the field, and the psychological trauma of constant warfare. Veterans who survived their military obligations often returned home with permanent disabilities, chronic health problems, and no reliable means of support in a society that provided minimal care for injured former soldiers. The entertainment that Romans are famous for, gladiatorial games and public spectacles, were themselves sources of danger for spectators as well as participants. Amphitheatres could collapse, killing hundreds of people in a single incident. Crowds at public events were prone to stampedes and riots that trampled innocent bystanders. Even passive entertainment carried risks in a society where large gatherings always held the potential for violence and chaos. As we prepare to leave the marble halls and blood-soaked streets of Rome behind, it's crucial to understand that this supposedly advanced civilization was built on foundations of systematic brutality and premature death. The engineering marvels and cultural achievements that we admire today were created by people who lived with the constant knowledge that survival was never guaranteed and that the very systems designed to protect them often became sources of mortal danger. Roman citizens enjoyed technological advances, legal protections, and cultural sophistication that were remarkable for their time. But none of these innovations could fully shield them from the fundamental hostility of urban life in the ancient world. Every Roman who reached old age had survived not just the passage of time, but a complex web of interconnected threats that claimed the majority of their contemporaries during their most productive years. The Roman Empire's collapse wasn't just a political event. It was the inevitable result of a civilization that had created living conditions so dangerous and unsustainable that they eventually consumed the very foundations of imperial power. But even as Rome crumbled, humanity wasn't finished with deadly historical periods. Our final destination awaits, a time when the collapse of centralized authority created new categories of danger that would test human survival in ways that made even Roman urban life seem manageable by comparison. The medieval period beckons, where the end of imperial protection meant that death lurked around every corner in forms both familiar and terrifyingly new. Where disease, violence, and social chaos combined to create survival challenges that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. Where your chances of living to see your 40th birthday were so slim that most people didn't even bother planning that far into the future. The future. Welcome to humanity's darkest chapter, where the collapse of Roman civilization didn't bring freedom, but unleashed 1,000 years of horror that made imperial oppression look like paradise. The medieval period wasn't just the Dark Ages. It was humanity's longest-running experiment in how many different ways a single day could kill you. If you thought Roman urban life was dangerous, medieval existence was exponentially worse. Murder rates were 10 times higher than they are today. That means walking down a medieval street carried the same statistical risk as voluntarily entering a modern war zone. But unlike war zones, there was no safe area to retreat to, no peacekeeping forces to maintain order, and no medical evacuation if something went wrong. Let's start with the most fundamental threat to medieval survival, one that claimed more lives than all the wars and plagues combined. Childbirth in the medieval world was essentially a death sentence that women faced multiple times throughout their short lives. The numbers are so horrifying that many women wrote their final wills before going into labor, treating pregnancy as a terminal diagnosis rather than a joyful expectation. Medieval obstetrics consisted of prayers, herbal remedies that rarely worked, and midwives whose training came from watching other women die in agony. Breech births killed both mother and child with devastating regularity. Labor could continue for days, while women slowly died from exhaustion, dehydration, and internal injuries that couldn't be treated with available medical knowledge. Even women who survived the birth faced puerperal fever, a bacterial infection that killed new mothers within days or weeks of delivery. The midwives who attended these births were often well-meaning, but completely unprepared for medical emergencies. They had no understanding of sterile conditions, no effective pain management techniques, and no surgical interventions available when complications arose. Their primary tools were hope, prayer, and folk remedies that sometimes hastened death rather than preventing it. Caesarean sections existed in medieval medical knowledge, but they were only performed when the mother was already dead or dying, and even then, they rarely saved the infant. The procedure was viewed as a last resort for extracting a child from a deceased mother, not as a life-saving intervention for living women facing difficult births. The survival rate for both mother and child in complicated deliveries was so low that many families simply expected to lose loved ones during childbirth. But surviving birth was just the beginning of a medieval childhood that resembled a prolonged game of Russian roulette with death. Infant mortality reached 25%, meaning 1 out of every 4 babies died within their first year of life. By age 5, 1/3 of all children had perished from diseases that are easily preventable today. Medieval parents couldn't allow themselves to become too attached to their young children because the statistical probability of loss was overwhelming. The diseases that killed medieval children were both familiar and exotic by modern standards. Dysentery caused by contaminated water led to fatal dehydration. Respiratory infections that would respond to modern antibiotics became death sentences. Parasitic worms consumed children's nutrients, leading to malnutrition and eventual death. Simple accidents that might require stitches today could become infected wounds that killed through blood poisoning. Medieval medical treatment was more likely to kill patients than cure them, creating a paradoxical situation where avoiding doctors increased your chances of survival. The medical profession included barber surgeons who treated patients with the same tools they used for haircuts, leading to infection rates that were staggeringly high. Surgical instruments were never sterilized between patients, spreading disease from one victim to the next with mechanical efficiency. Bloodletting was considered the universal cure for almost every ailment, despite the fact that it weakened patients and often hastened their deaths. Medieval physicians would drain significant amounts of blood from patients suffering from illnesses that actually required nutrition and rest to recover. The practice was so widespread and so deadly that some historians suggest George Washington might have been killed by aggressive bloodletting rather than the strep throat his doctors were supposedly treating. Leeches were applied to patients suffering from conditions that had nothing to do with blood circulation, creating open wounds that frequently became infected. Herbal remedies were often toxic substances that poisoned patients while providing no therapeutic benefit. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, causing shock and trauma that killed many patients who might have survived their original injuries. The dental situation in medieval times was a special category of horror that affected everyone regardless of social status. Tooth decay was rampant due to limited understanding of oral hygiene, and the remedies available were often worse than the original problems. Tooth extraction was performed with crude tools that frequently shattered teeth rather than removing them cleanly, leaving infected root fragments that could cause fatal abscesses. Medieval dentistry consisted primarily of pulling teeth with pliers, filing down painful surfaces with rough tools, and applying caustic substances that destroyed healthy tissue along with diseased areas. There was no understanding of the connection between oral infections and systemic health, so dental abscesses were allowed to spread throughout patients' bodies, causing blood poisoning, heart infections, and brain damage that led to death. Food safety in the medieval world created daily gambling situations where every meal could be your last. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly and harbored deadly bacteria that caused severe food poisoning. Grain storage attracted rodents that contaminated food supplies with waste and parasites. Bread, the staple food for most people, was often made from grain that had been contaminated with ergot fungus, causing hallucinations, convulsions, and death. The ergot poisoning situation was particularly terrifying because entire communities could be affected simultaneously when contaminated grain was used for bread making. Symptoms included burning sensations in the extremities, hallucinations that could last for days, seizures that could cause permanent brain damage, and gangrene that required amputation of affected limbs. Communities struck by ergot poisoning often interpreted the mass hallucinations as supernatural events, leading to witch hunts and other violence that claimed additional lives. Water sources in medieval communities were routinely contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff from activities like tanning and metalworking. Wells were often located too close to waste disposal areas, creating direct pathways for contamination to reach drinking water. Rivers and streams served as both water sources and waste disposal systems, ensuring that downstream communities consumed whatever upstream settlements had discarded. Dysentery and cholera spread rapidly through communities that shared contaminated water sources, killing people through severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. These diseases could wipe out significant portions of villages within weeks, particularly affecting children and elderly residents who were less able to survive the physical stress of prolonged illness. The agricultural system that sustained medieval life was incredibly fragile and subject to catastrophic failures that could starve entire regions. Weather patterns that we would consider minor variations today could destroy harvests and plunge communities into famine that lasted for years. A late spring frost, excessive rain during harvest season, or prolonged drought could eliminate food supplies and condemn thousands of people to slow death by starvation. Medieval farming techniques provided minimal buffer against crop failures, and there were no effective systems for distributing food from areas of surplus to regions experiencing shortage. When harvests failed, people were forced to eat anything available, including tree bark, grass, and substances that were toxic but seemed preferable to starvation. These desperate measures often led to poisoning that killed people who might have survived if they had simply continued fasting. The social structure of medieval society created additional survival challenges through systems of obligation and control that trapped people in dangerous situations. Serfs were bound to land owned by feudal lords and couldn't leave even when local conditions became life-threatening. This meant that communities facing famine, disease outbreaks, or military attacks couldn't relocate to safer areas, forcing them to endure deadly conditions that could have been avoided through mobility. Medieval warfare was particularly brutal and affected civilian populations as much as military forces. Armies routinely destroyed crops, contaminated water supplies, and burned villages to deny resources to their enemies. These scorched earth tactics created famines and refugee crises that killed more people than actual combat. Civilians caught in war zones faced rape, murder, and enslavement regardless of their political loyalties or personal involvement in conflicts. The weapons used in medieval warfare were designed to cause maximum suffering rather than quick deaths. Crossbow bolts, battle axes, and maces created horrific wounds that often led to slow death from infection and blood loss. Medical care for wounded soldiers was virtually non-existent, meaning that surviving a battle was only the beginning of a struggle against sepsis, gangrene, and other complications that frequently proved fatal. Siege warfare was particularly deadly for civilian populations trapped in defended cities. Attackers would surround settlements and prevent food, water, and medical supplies from reaching residents, creating conditions that forced surrender through starvation and disease rather than direct assault. These sieges could last for months, during which time civilians died from hunger, thirst, and illnesses that spread rapidly in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The criminal justice system in medieval times was based on physical punishment and execution rather than rehabilitation or deterrence. Torture was routinely used to extract confessions, often from people who were innocent of the crimes they were accused of committing. The torture methods themselves were frequently fatal, meaning that accused individuals could die during interrogation regardless of their guilt or innocence. Public executions were common entertainment events that drew large crowds, but they also served as reminders that death was always close at hand in medieval society. Hanging, burning, and other execution methods were designed to be slow and painful, serving as deterrents through the spectacle of suffering rather than the finality of death. The legal system provided minimal protection for ordinary people, particularly women, children, and anyone without significant wealth or social connections. Accusations of witchcraft could result in torture and execution based on little or no evidence. Property disputes were often settled through violence rather than legal proceedings. Personal vendettas could escalate into blood feuds that lasted for generations and claimed dozens of lives. Religious persecution created another category of medieval dangers that could destroy individuals and entire communities. The Crusades, Inquisition, and various religious wars killed millions of people whose only crime was holding beliefs that differed from those in political power. Even seemingly minor religious infractions could result in excommunication, social ostracism, and economic ruin that led to starvation and death. The housing conditions available to most medieval people were barely adequate for survival and often contributed to illness and death. Homes were poorly ventilated, allowing smoke from cooking fires to accumulate and cause respiratory problems. Thatched roofs harboured insects and rodents that spread disease and contaminated food supplies. Floors were often dirt surfaces that couldn't be properly cleaned and became breeding grounds for parasites and bacteria. Medieval homes had no plumbing or sanitation systems, forcing families to live in close proximity to human waste that attracted disease-carrying pests. Shared sleeping areas facilitated the spread of respiratory illnesses, skin conditions, and parasitic infestations between family members. Privacy was minimal, and sick individuals couldn't be isolated effectively, ensuring that contagious diseases affected entire households. Fire was a constant threat in medieval communities, where homes were constructed primarily from wood, straw, and other flammable materials. Cooking fires, heating fires, and candles created multiple ignition sources in every household, and there were no effective firefighting services to control blazes once they started. Entire villages could be destroyed in a matter of hours, leaving survivors without shelter, food, or possessions necessary for survival. The economic system of medieval times created perpetual insecurity for most people, who lived without savings, insurance, or social safety nets that could protect them during emergencies. Crop failures, illness, or injury could immediately reduce families to destitution and starvation. There were no unemployment benefits, disability payments, or charitable organizations capable of providing long-term assistance to people facing economic hardship. Medieval transportation was dangerous and unreliable, making travel a potentially fatal undertaking that most people avoided unless absolutely necessary. Roads were poorly maintained and frequently impassable due to weather conditions, bandit activity, or military conflicts. Travelers faced robbery, assault, and murder from highwaymen who operated with minimal fear of law enforcement. Getting lost during travel could mean death from exposure, starvation, or wild animal attacks. The educational system in medieval times was extremely limited, leaving most people without knowledge that could help them survive emergencies or make informed decisions about their health and safety. Literacy rates were extraordinarily low, preventing people from accessing written information about medical treatments, agricultural techniques, or other survival skills. This ignorance made populations vulnerable to preventable disasters and exploitation by those with greater knowledge. Weather extremes during the medieval period created survival challenges that modern people can barely imagine. The Little Ice Age brought extended periods of cold weather that destroyed crops and made heating costs prohibitive for poor families. Extended droughts caused famines that lasted for years and forced people to abandon their homes in search of food and water. Severe storms could destroy entire harvests in single events, condemning communities to months or years of hunger. The psychological toll of medieval life was enormous, as people lived with constant awareness that death could come at any moment from countless different sources. The combination of physical hardship, social violence, economic insecurity, and medical ignorance created levels of stress and anxiety that would be considered pathological by modern standards. Mental health problems were interpreted as supernatural phenomena, leading to treatments that often made conditions worse rather than providing relief. Despite all these dangers, some people did manage to survive into middle age and beyond, but they did so by developing survival instincts, social networks, and practical skills that allowed them to navigate the countless threats of medieval existence. Those who lived longest were typically those who could adapt quickly to changing conditions, avoid unnecessary risks, and maintain relationships that provided mutual support during emergencies. As we stand at the threshold of completing our journey through history's deadliest eras, it becomes clear that survival in any of these periods required not just luck, but extraordinary resilience, intelligence, and determination. The medieval world represents the culmination of humanity's struggle against hostile environments, but it also demonstrates our species' remarkable to endure conditions that would destroy most other forms of life. Every person who survived these historical periods possessed qualities that enabled them to overcome seemingly impossible odds. They developed skills, formed alliances, and made countless life or death decisions that allowed them to pass their genetic heritage down to future generations. Understanding their struggles and achievements provides insight into both the fragility and the strength of human life throughout history. The question that haunts every person who has ever wondered about their own survival instincts is this: what separates those who lived from the countless millions who perished in humanity's deadliest eras? As we've journeyed through ice ages that froze entire continents, ancient civilizations where paradise masked deadly perils, imperial grandeur built on foundations of urban horror, and medieval darkness where death stalked every street corner, one truth becomes undeniably clear. Survival in these periods wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It was about making the right choices at the right moments, often with incomplete information and under extreme pressure. The people who lived long enough to become our ancestors possessed something that transcended physical strength or intelligence. They had an almost supernatural ability to assess danger, adapt to changing circumstances, and make split-second decisions that meant the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming another statistic in history's brutal ledger. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. The very qualities that enabled survival in these deadly eras are still buried deep within your DNA. The genetic legacy of Ice Age hunters who stalked mammoths, Egyptian workers who dodged crocodiles, Roman citizens who navigated urban death traps, and medieval survivors who endured humanity's darkest chapter lives on in every cell of your body. The question isn't whether you have these survival instincts. The question is whether you could access them when your life depended on it. Consider the psychological profiles of people who survived each era. Ice Age survivors had to maintain absolute focus during hunts that could last for days, where a single moment of inattention meant death for themselves and starvation for their entire tribe. They developed pattern recognition skills that allowed them to track animals across vast distances, predict weather changes that could kill them within hours, and coordinate complex group activities without modern communication systems. These weren't casual abilities that developed over comfortable lifetimes. They were survival skills forged in conditions so harsh that failure meant immediate extinction. Every Ice Age survivor had watched friends and family members die from exposure, starvation, and predator attacks. They had personally experienced the terror of being stalked by cave bears and saber-toothed cats that viewed humans as potential prey rather than apex predators. The mental toughness required to function effectively under these conditions is almost incomprehensible to modern minds accustomed to safety and comfort. Ice Age humans had to make life or death decisions while exhausted from malnutrition, suffering from injuries that would require emergency medical attention today, and operating in social groups where personality conflicts could doom entire communities to extinction. Egyptian survivors developed different but equally remarkable psychological adaptations. They learned to live with constant awareness of invisible threats that could kill them slowly or quickly, depending on their daily choices. Every trip to the Nile carried the possibility of crocodile or hippo attacks, parasitic infections that would destroy their internal organs, or waterborne diseases that could kill them within days. The Egyptians who lived longest were those who could balance calculated risks with necessary activities. They had to collect water, fish, farm, and transport goods along the river, while maintaining constant vigilance for threats that could emerge without warning. This required a form of situational awareness that modern people rarely develop, even in dangerous professions like law enforcement or military service. Egyptian survivors also had to navigate complex social hierarchies, where political changes could mean the difference between prosperity and death. They learned to read social cues that indicated shifting power structures, impending violence, or opportunities for advancement that could improve their survival odds. The psychological flexibility required to adapt to new rulers, changing economic conditions, and evolving social expectations while maintaining personal safety was extraordinary. Roman survivors faced perhaps the most complex psychological challenges of any historical period. They had to function effectively in urban environments where multiple deadly threats operated simultaneously. The Romans who lived longest were those who could assess and respond to immediate physical dangers like fires, floods, and building collapses, while also managing longer-term threats like disease, political violence, and economic instability. Roman urban survival required sophisticated risk management skills that involved constantly balancing competing priorities. Should you seek medical treatment for an injury and risk death from primitive surgical procedures, or endure pain and potential disability while hoping for natural healing? Should you invest in better housing that might protect you from fires, but also make you a target for robbery and political persecution? The Romans who survived these daily dilemmas developed decision-making processes that incorporated multiple variables and potential outcomes in ways that modern people rarely experience. They had to become experts in human psychology, understanding how crowds behaved during emergencies, how political changes affected personal safety, and how economic fluctuations created opportunities or dangers for different social classes. Medieval survivors required perhaps the most diverse psychological skill set of any historical period. They had to navigate a world where violence was endemic, medical treatment was often fatal, food safety was constantly questionable, and social institutions provided minimal protection for ordinary people. The medieval period demanded psychological resilience that could withstand repeated trauma, loss, and disappointment, while maintaining the motivation to continue fighting for survival. Medieval survivors developed extraordinary tolerance for uncertainty and discomfort. They learned to function effectively while hungry, cold, injured, and emotionally devastated by the deaths of family members and friends. They had to make important decisions about resource allocation, social relationships, and personal safety while operating under conditions of chronic stress that would disable most modern individuals. The psychological adaptation that enabled medieval survival involved accepting that life was fundamentally dangerous and unpredictable while still maintaining hope and motivation for continued existence. This required a form of mental compartmentalization that allowed people to experience joy, love, and satisfaction even while living with constant awareness of mortality and suffering. Now here's the crucial question that determines whether you would survive these historical periods. Do you possess the psychological flexibility to adapt your modern mindset to historical realities? Most people today have been conditioned to expect safety, comfort, and predictability in ways that would be completely maladaptive in dangerous historical environments. Modern humans often struggle with relatively minor inconveniences like traffic delays, internet outages, or uncomfortable temperatures. we seek immediate solutions to problems and become frustrated when circumstances don't meet our expectations. These psychological patterns would be fatal in historical contexts where patience, endurance, and acceptance of discomfort were essential survival skills. The people who would be most likely to survive dangerous historical periods are those who already demonstrate psychological resilience in modern contexts. These are individuals who remain calm during emergencies, who can function effectively under stress, who adapt quickly to changing circumstances, and who maintain focus on long-term survival rather than immediate comfort. But psychological adaptability alone wouldn't be enough to ensure survival in history's deadliest eras. You would also need to rapidly acquire practical skills that modern education systems don't teach. Ice Age survival required detailed knowledge of animal behavior, weather patterns, tool making, food preservation, and group coordination under extreme conditions. Egyptian survival demanded understanding of water safety, disease recognition, agricultural techniques, construction skills, and navigation in both urban and desert environments. Roman survival required knowledge of urban hazards, basic medical care, food safety, political awareness, and emergency response procedures for fires, floods, and building collapses. Medieval survival involved the most comprehensive skill set of any historical period. You would need to understand agriculture, food preservation, basic medical treatment, weapon use, construction techniques, social protocols, legal systems, and survival strategies for various types of emergencies and disasters. The learning curve for acquiring these skills would be incredibly steep, and you would have to master them while dealing with the physical and psychological stresses of actually living in these dangerous environments. There would be no practice runs or safe learning environments where you could make mistakes without fatal consequences. Your modern advantages and disadvantages would create a complex survival profile that would be difficult to predict. Modern humans have better nutrition, education, and understanding of basic scientific principles that could provide significant advantages in historical contexts. You understand concepts like infection control, the importance of clean water, and basic first aid that could dramatically improve your survival odds. However, modern humans also have physical and psychological dependencies that would be severe disadvantages in historical environments. Most modern people lack the physical strength and endurance that were essential for survival in earlier eras. We have become accustomed to processed foods, climate-controlled environments, and medical interventions that wouldn't be available in historical contexts. The psychological dependencies might be even more problematic than the physical ones. Modern humans are accustomed to entertainment, privacy, social validation, and emotional support systems that wouldn't exist in historical environments. The isolation, boredom, and emotional trauma of historical survival might be more difficult for modern people to endure than the physical hardships. Your survival odds would also depend heavily on which specific time period and location you found yourself in. Landing among a well-organized Ice Age tribe with established hunting territories and survival knowledge would give you much better chances than finding yourself alone in the wilderness during the harshest part of the glacial maximum. Arriving in ancient Egypt during a stable political period with good Nile flooding would be far preferable to appearing during times of drought, foreign invasion, or political chaos. Roman survival would depend enormously on your social status, location within the empire, and timing relative to major disasters like plagues, fires, or military conflicts. Medieval survival would be influenced by countless variables, including regional political stability, agricultural conditions, disease outbreaks, weather patterns, and local social structures. The difference between landing in a relatively prosperous medieval community during good harvest years versus arriving during times of famine, warfare, or plague outbreaks could easily determine whether you survived your first month or first week. The social integration challenges would be particularly difficult for modern people attempting to survive in historical contexts. Language barriers alone could be fatal if they prevented you from understanding warnings, instructions, or social expectations that were essential for safety. Cultural differences in behavior, dress, and social interactions could mark you as an outsider and create additional dangers from suspicious or hostile community members. Religious and superstitious beliefs in historical periods could create survival challenges that modern people would struggle to navigate. Demonstrating knowledge or behaviors that seemed supernatural or heretical could result in persecution, exile, or execution. Failing to participate appropriately in religious observances or social rituals could create social isolation that reduced your access to community protection and resources. The gender dynamics of historical periods would create dramatically different survival challenges for men and women. Women in most historical contexts faced restrictions on mobility, property ownership, and social participation that would be alien and frustrating to modern women accustomed to equality and independence. However, women also had access to certain social networks and survival strategies that might not be available to men. Men in historical periods were expected to demonstrate physical courage, combat skills, and leadership abilities that many modern men haven't developed. The social pressure to participate in dangerous activities like hunting, warfare, or hazardous occupations could force modern men into situations where their lack of relevant experience would be fatal. Age would be another critical factor determining survival odds in historical contexts. Young adults would have the best combination of physical capability and learning capacity needed to adapt to historical survival challenges. Children would be extremely vulnerable due to their dependence on adult protection and their increased susceptibility to diseases and environmental hazards. Older adults would face significant challenges due to the physical demands of historical survival, but they might have better psychological coping mechanisms for dealing with hardship, uncertainty, and loss. The accumulated life experience and emotional resilience of older individuals could provide advantages that might partially compensate for reduced physical capabilities. Health status at the time of arrival in historical contexts would dramatically influence survival prospects. Modern people with chronic medical conditions that require ongoing treatment would face immediate life-threatening situations in eras without effective medical care. Diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, and other conditions that are manageable today would become death sentences in historical environments. Even relatively minor modern health issues could become major survival challenges in historical contexts. Dental problems that require routine treatment today could develop into life-threatening infections in eras without effective dental care. Vision problems that are easily corrected with glasses or surgery could create dangerous vulnerabilities in environments where sharp eyesight was essential for recognizing threats and opportunities. The physical fitness levels of modern people would need dramatic improvement to meet the demands of historical survival. The cardiovascular endurance, muscular strength, and coordination required for activities like Ice Age hunting, Egyptian manual labor, Roman urban navigation, or medieval agricultural work would challenge even modern people who consider themselves physically fit. Mental health challenges would be particularly difficult to manage in historical contexts, where psychological problems were misunderstood and often attributed to supernatural causes. Modern people who rely on medications, therapy, or other interventions for conditions like depression, anxiety, or attention disorders would have to find ways to cope without these supports while dealing with trauma and stress levels that exceed anything most modern people have experienced. The social skills required for historical survival would be dramatically different from those valued in modern contexts. Success in historical environments required abilities to form alliances, negotiate conflicts, and maintain relationships under conditions of extreme stress and competition for limited resources. Modern social skills focused on professional networking, romantic relationships, and casual friendships might not translate effectively to survival-focused historical social dynamics. Leadership and followership skills would be essential for historical survival. as individual survival was almost always dependent on group cooperation and coordination. Modern people accustomed to individualistic approaches to problem solving might struggle with the collective decision-making and resource sharing that were necessary for group survival in historical contexts. Communication skills would need rapid adaptation to historical contexts, where direct, clear information exchange could mean the difference between life and death. Modern communication patterns that emphasize politeness, diplomacy, and emotional sensitivity might be less effective than historically appropriate styles that prioritized efficiency and clarity in critical situations. The moral and ethical frameworks that guide modern decision-making might need significant adjustment to historical survival realities. Modern values, emphasizing individual rights, equality, and humanitarian concerns, might conflict with historical survival strategies that required harsh choices about resource allocation, group membership, and responses to threats. Historical survival often required participating in or accepting practices that would be considered unethical by modern standards. Violence, discrimination, and exploitation were common elements of historical societies that couldn't be avoided without risking social isolation and reduced survival chances. Modern people might struggle with the moral compromises required for historical survival. The time perspectives required for historical survival would be fundamentally different from modern approaches to planning and goal setting. Historical survival required balancing immediate needs for safety and resources with longer-term strategies for establishing security and social position. The planning horizons and risk assessment methods needed for historical survival would challenge modern people accustomed to predictable environments and institutional support systems. As we approach the conclusion of our journey through history's deadliest eras, the ultimate question remains: would you have what it takes to join the ranks of those extraordinary individuals who survived when most others perished? The answer isn't simply yes or no. It's a complex equation involving your existing psychological resilience, physical capabilities, learning capacity, and ability to adapt fundamental aspects of your worldview and behavior patterns. The legacy of historical survivors lives within every modern human, but accessing that legacy would require dismantling many of the psychological and social adaptations that make us successful in contemporary environments. The very qualities that make modern life comfortable and predictable might be the greatest obstacles to survival in historical contexts, where flexibility, endurance, and acceptance of harsh realities were essential for staying alive. But perhaps the most important lesson from our exploration of history's deadliest eras isn't whether you could survive them. Perhaps it's recognition of the extraordinary courage, intelligence, and determination demonstrated by our ancestors who did survive these impossible conditions. Their legacy isn't just genetic, it's a testament to the remarkable resilience and adaptability that define human nature at its finest. Every comfortable moment you experience today, every medical treatment that saves lives, every social institution that provides security exists because people who lived before you refused to surrender when survival seemed impossible. They fought through ice ages that should have driven our species to extinction, built civilizations in environments that killed most of their contemporaries, and maintained hope during humanity's darkest periods when death seemed to lurk around every corner. Understanding their struggles doesn't just satisfy historical curiosity, it provides perspective on the challenges we face today, an insight into the human capacity for survival under seemingly impossible conditions. The next time you face difficulties that seem overwhelming, remember that you carry within yourself the genetic and cultural legacy of people who survived the ultimate tests of human endurance. The question isn't whether you would survive history's deadliest eras. The question is whether you can honor the legacy of those who did by living with the same courage, determination, and resilience they demonstrated when survival was never guaranteed, and every day brought new threats that could end life without warning. Their story is your story, and their strength lives on in every choice you make to persevere when circumstances seem impossible. Your survival chances in these historical nightmares would ultimately depend on one crucial factor that most people never consider. It's not your physical strength, your modern knowledge, or even your intelligence. It's your ability to make the right decision in the split second between life and death, when your brain is flooded with terror and your body is screaming at you to run. The psychological profile of historical survivors reveals something fascinating and disturbing. These weren't necessarily the smartest or strongest people of their time. They were the ones who could think clearly while watching their children die from diseases they couldn't understand. They could make rational resource allocation decisions while their stomachs cramped from hunger. They could maintain social relationships and group loyalty even when cooperation meant sharing food they desperately needed for their own survival. Modern psychological research suggests that this kind of mental resilience can be developed, but it requires experiencing genuine hardship and learning to function effectively despite fear, pain, and uncertainty. Most modern humans have been so protected from real danger that we've never had the opportunity to discover whether we possess these crucial survival instincts. Consider the decision-making speed required for Ice Age survival. When a mammoth hunt went wrong and 12 tons of furious animal was charging directly at you, you had perhaps 2 seconds to decide whether to dodge left, dodge right, stand your ground with your spear, or attempt to climb the nearest rock formation. The wrong choice meant being trampled into an unrecognizable pace that would feed scavengers for weeks. These weren't decisions you could think through logically. They required instantaneous assessment of terrain, animal behavior, weapon positioning, and escape routes, while operating under levels of adrenaline that would incapacitate most modern people. The Ice Age hunters who survived long enough to reproduce were those whose brains could process multiple variables and execute complex physical movements in timeframes measured in milliseconds. Egyptian survival demanded a completely different but equally sophisticated decision-making process. When you approached the Nile to collect water and spotted something moving beneath the surface, you had to instantly determine whether it was a fish, a floating log, or a 20-foot crocodile preparing to launch itself onto the riverbank. The visual cues were subtle, the lighting conditions were often poor, and the consequences of misidentification were immediately fatal. Egyptian workers who lived longest were those who developed almost supernatural awareness of their environment. They could detect the subtle changes in water patterns that indicated submerged hippos. They could recognize the behavioral signs that meant their co-workers were developing parasitic infections that would soon become contagious. They could identify which food sources were safe and which carried deadly bacteria, often based on minor differences in appearance, smell, or texture. Roman urban survival required perhaps the most complex real-time risk assessment of any historical period. When you heard shouting in the street outside your tenement building, you had seconds to determine whether it indicated a fire that required immediate evacuation, a riot that meant you should barricade your door, a military action that demanded choosing sides, or a celebration that was safe to ignore. The Romans who survived longest in urban environments were those who could rapidly process acoustic, visual, and social cues to assess multiple simultaneous threats. They learned to recognize the specific sounds that indicated different types of emergencies. They could evaluate crowd behavior patterns to predict whether situations would escalate or dissipate. They developed networks of social relationships that provided early warning about political changes, economic disruptions, and disease outbreaks. Medieval survival demanded the most comprehensive threat assessment capabilities of any historical period. The dangers were so numerous and varied that successful survival required constantly scanning the environment for signs of violence, disease, food contamination, weather changes, social tensions, and economic instability. Medieval survivors had to become experts at reading human behavior, animal behavior, weather patterns, plant identification, social hierarchies, and political undercurrents simultaneously. The speed and accuracy of these assessments determined whether medieval people lived through each day, or joined the countless millions who perished from threats they failed to recognize quickly enough. A slight change in a neighbor's behavior might indicate developing mental illness that could lead to violence. A subtle alteration in grain appearance might signal ergot contamination that could kill entire families. A minor shift in local political rhetoric might foreshadow persecution that required immediate relocation. Your modern brain has been trained to process entirely different categories of information than what would be essential for historical survival. You can navigate complex digital interfaces, understand abstract financial concepts, and manage multiple social media relationships simultaneously. But could you instantly recognize the difference between edible and poisonous mushrooms when your survival depended on foraging? Could you assess whether a stranger approaching your medieval village represented an opportunity for trade or a threat requiring defensive action? The learning curve for developing historical survival instincts would be incredibly steep, because you would have to acquire new pattern recognition abilities while unlearning modern safety assumptions that could get you killed. Your brain has been conditioned to expect that food is safe, water is clean, strangers are generally harmless, and help is available during emergencies. Every one of these assumptions would be fatally wrong in historical contexts. Modern humans also lack the physical conditioning that was essential for historical survival. Your cardiovascular system hasn't been developed through daily activities that required sustained physical exertion under life-threatening conditions. Your muscles haven't been strengthened through manual labor that involved lifting, carrying, and manipulating heavy objects for hours at a time. Your coordination and balance haven't been refined through activities where physical mistakes could result in immediate death. The pain tolerance required for historical survival would challenge most modern people beyond their breaking points. Ice Age hunters had to continue functioning effectively while suffering from injuries that would require emergency medical attention today. Egyptian workers had to maintain productivity while dealing with chronic pain from parasitic infections, joint damage, and repetitive stress injuries. Roman citizens had to navigate urban hazards while coping with untreated medical conditions that cause constant discomfort. Medieval people had to perform essential survival tasks while enduring levels of physical suffering that modern humans rarely experience. Toothaches that would send contemporary people to emergency dentists had to be ignored while continuing to work, fight, and care for family members. Broken bones had to heal naturally while people continued performing physical labor necessary for survival. Chronic illnesses had to be managed without effective treatments while maintaining alertness for numerous environmental threats. The social skills required for historical survival would be completely foreign to most modern people. Success in dangerous historical environments required forming alliances based on mutual survival benefit rather than personal compatibility or shared interests. You would need to evaluate potential partners based on their practical skills, reliability under stress, and willingness to share resources during emergencies. Historical social dynamics involved constant negotiation over resource allocation, work assignments, and group decision-making under conditions where mistakes could doom entire communities. The diplomatic skills required to maintain group cohesion while competing for limited resources would challenge even modern people with extensive experience in conflict resolution and team management. Leadership responsibilities in historical contexts carried life and death consequences that modern leaders rarely face. Making wrong decisions about hunting strategies, migration routes, defensive preparations, or resource distribution could result in the deaths of everyone who trusted your judgment. The psychological pressure of bearing responsibility for other people's survival under conditions of extreme uncertainty would crush most modern individuals who are accustomed to shared responsibility and institutional support systems. The emotional resilience required for historical survival involved processing levels of trauma and loss that would overwhelm contemporary mental health systems. Watching children die from diseases you couldn't treat, losing friends and family members to violence and accidents, and living with constant awareness of your own mortality required psychological coping mechanisms that most modern people have never needed to develop. Historical survivors had to maintain motivation and hope while experiencing repeated devastating losses that would trigger severe depression and anxiety disorders in contemporary populations. They had to continue fighting for survival while grieving for loved ones, often without time for proper mourning rituals or emotional processing. They had to form new relationships and emotional attachments while knowing that future losses were statistically inevitable. The moral flexibility required for historical survival would challenge modern ethical frameworks in ways that could cause severe psychological distress. Survival in dangerous historical environments sometimes required making choices that violated contemporary moral standards. Resource scarcity forced difficult decisions about who received food, medical care, and protection when there wasn't enough for everyone. Historical social structures often required participating in or accepting practices that modern people would find morally reprehensible. Slavery, violence against vulnerable populations, and discrimination based on gender, social status, and ethnic background were integral parts of historical societies that couldn't be avoided without risking social isolation and reduced survival chances. The time management skills required for historical survival would be completely different from contemporary approaches to scheduling and productivity. Historical survival required balancing immediate needs for safety and resources with longer-term strategies for establishing security and improving living conditions. The planning horizons were simultaneously shorter and longer than modern time management, requiring attention to immediate threats while also preparing for seasonal changes, potential disasters, and long-term social developments. Your modern lifestyle has created dependencies that would become severe vulnerabilities in historical contexts. Reliance on processed foods, climate-controlled environments, artificial lighting, and electronic communication systems would leave you unprepared for the self-sufficiency required for historical survival. The transition period during which you learn to function without these modern conveniences could easily become a fatal vulnerability window. Modern medical dependencies would create immediate life-threatening situations for many contemporary people attempting historical survival. Prescription medications for chronic conditions wouldn't be available, forcing people to manage diabetes, heart disease, mental health disorders, and other conditions without effective treatments. Even minor medical issues that are easily addressed today could become major survival challenges in historical contexts. The sleep patterns required for historical survival would be dramatically different from contemporary sleep habits. Historical survival often required irregular sleep schedules based on threats, opportunities, and environmental conditions rather than consistent daily routines. Guard duties, hunting activities, and emergency responses meant that historical survivors had to function effectively despite chronic sleep deprivation and irregular rest patterns. Food acquisition and consumption in historical contexts required knowledge and skills that modern people lack entirely. Hunting, foraging, food preservation, and cooking with primitive tools demanded expertise that took years to develop and could mean the difference between nutrition and starvation. The ability to identify safe food sources, prepare meals from raw ingredients, and preserve surplus food for future consumption would be essential survival skills that most modern people would need to learn from scratch. Water safety knowledge would be crucial for historical survival, but completely foreign to modern people accustomed to treated municipal water supplies. Identifying safe water sources, recognizing contamination signs, and treating water to reduce disease risks required practical experience that contemporary people lack. The consequences of making wrong decisions about water safety were immediate and often fatal. Tool-making and maintenance skills that were essential for historical survival have been largely eliminated from modern education and experience. Creating weapons, implements, and household items from raw materials required specialized knowledge that had to be learned through apprenticeship and practice. The ability to repair and modify tools using available materials could determine whether you could continue performing essential survival tasks. Navigation and geographic knowledge required for historical survival extended far beyond modern GPS dependencies. Historical survivors had to navigate using natural landmarks, celestial observations, and environmental cues, while understanding seasonal changes, weather patterns, and geographic hazards. Getting lost in historical context often meant death from exposure, starvation, or encounters with hostile humans or animals. Weather prediction abilities that were essential for historical survival required understanding natural indicators that modern people rarely notice. Historical survivors had to recognize signs of approaching storms, seasonal changes, and climate fluctuations that could affect food availability, travel safety, and shelter requirements. The ability to prepare for weather changes often determined whether people survived seasonal transitions and natural disasters. Animal behavior knowledge was crucial for historical survival, but largely absent from modern experience. Historical survivors had to understand which animals were dangerous, which could be hunted safely, which indicated environmental changes, and which behaviors suggested disease or other threats. The ability to read animal behavior could provide early warnings about natural disasters, human threats, and resource availability. Plant identification skills required for historical survival involved distinguishing between edible, medicinal, and poisonous species based on subtle visual differences that required extensive training to recognize. Mistakes in plant identification could result in poisoning, malnutrition, or missed opportunities for nutrition and medicine. The knowledge required for safe foraging took years to develop and was essential for survival during food shortages. Construction and shelter building skills that were necessary for historical survival required understanding materials, techniques, and environmental factors that modern people rarely encounter. Creating weatherproof, secure, and healthy living spaces using available materials demanded practical knowledge that had to be learned through experience and could mean the difference between survival and death during extreme weather conditions. Fire-making and maintenance abilities were essential for historical survival, but completely foreign to modern people accustomed to convenient ignition systems. Creating fire using primitive methods, maintaining fires under various weather conditions, and using fire for cooking, heating, and protection required skills that took considerable practice to master. The inability to create and maintain fire could quickly become a fatal vulnerability. Textile production and clothing repair skills that were necessary for historical survival involved creating, modifying, and maintaining garments using primitive tools and materials. The ability to produce weatherproof, durable clothing could determine whether people survived extreme temperatures and environmental conditions. Modern people lack the practical experience needed for textile production and clothing maintenance using historical methods. Food storage and preservation techniques required for historical survival involved preventing spoilage, contamination, and pest damage using methods that modern people rarely understand. The ability to preserve surplus food for consumption during shortages could mean the difference between survival and starvation during difficult periods. Mistakes in food preservation could result in poisoning, malnutrition, or loss of essential resources. The combat and self-defense skills required for historical survival would be completely foreign to most modern people who live in relatively peaceful societies with effective law enforcement. Historical survival often required the ability to use weapons effectively, recognize threatening situations, and respond appropriately to violence. The psychological willingness to use force when necessary for survival would challenge many modern people who have been conditioned to rely on institutional protection. Trade and negotiation skills that were essential for historical survival required understanding local customs, resource values, and social dynamics that varied dramatically between different historical contexts. The ability to establish beneficial relationships with strangers negotiate fair exchanges, and avoid being cheated or exploited could determine access to essential resources and information. The language and communication skills required for historical survival would involve not just vocabulary and grammar, but also understanding cultural nuances, social hierarchies, and communication styles that could affect your safety and social acceptance. Misunderstanding social cues or violating communication norms could result in ostracism, violence, or other consequences that reduced survival chances. Religious and cultural knowledge required for historical survival involved understanding local beliefs, practices, and taboos that could affect your social standing and physical safety. Failing to demonstrate appropriate religious observance or accidentally violating cultural norms could result in persecution, exile, or execution. The ability to navigate complex belief systems while maintaining personal integrity would be essential for long-term survival. Legal and political awareness required for historical survival involved understanding power structures, legal systems, and political dynamics that could dramatically affect your safety and opportunities. Changes in political leadership, legal interpretations, and social policies could create new dangers or opportunities that required rapid adaptation to maintain survival prospects. Economic understanding, required for historical survival, involved recognizing resource values, market dynamics, and economic trends that affected food availability, employment opportunities, and social stability. The ability to anticipate economic changes and adapt survival strategies accordingly could determine whether you maintained access to essential resources during difficult periods. As we reach the final stage of our journey through history's deadliest eras, one truth becomes inescapably clear. The gap between modern life and historical survival realities is so vast that most contemporary people would struggle to survive even a single week in these dangerous environments. We have become so specialized for success in technological civilization that we have lost most of the practical skills and psychological adaptations that were essential for survival throughout most of human history. But this doesn't mean that modern humans are fundamentally weaker or less capable than our ancestors. It means that we have evolved different strengths and capabilities that are optimized for contemporary challenges, rather than historical survival scenarios. The question isn't whether you could survive in history's deadliest eras, but whether you can appreciate the extraordinary achievements of those who did survive these impossible conditions. Every modern convenience you enjoy, every medical treatment that saves lives, every social institution that provides security exists because people who lived before you refused to surrender when survival seemed impossible. They developed the knowledge, skills, and technologies that eventually led to the safer, more predictable world we inhabit today. Their legacy lives on not just in our genetic inheritance, but in our capacity for resilience, adaptation, and survival when circumstances demand it. The same human potential that enabled our ancestors to survive ice ages, build civilizations in hostile environments, and endure humanity's darkest periods still exists within every modern person. It may be dormant, undeveloped, or redirected toward contemporary challenges, but it remains part of our fundamental nature. The real question isn't whether you would survive history's deadliest eras. The real question is whether you will honor the legacy of those who did survive by living with courage, determination, and appreciation for the extraordinary gift of life they made possible through their struggles and sacrifices. Their survival instincts didn't disappear when they died. They became part of the genetic code that flows through your veins right now. But here's what's truly terrifying to consider. The comfortable, predictable world we've built around ourselves might actually be making us weaker, less adaptable, and more vulnerable than any generation in human history. Think about it. When was the last time you went more than a few hours without food and felt genuinely concerned about starvation? When did you last experience true physical danger where your survival instincts had to kick in? Most modern humans live their entire lives without ever discovering whether they possess the psychological fortitude that kept our ancestors alive through humanity's darkest chapters. We've created a world so safe and predictable that we panic when our internet goes down for an hour. We consider it a crisis when our favorite restaurant runs out of our preferred menu item. We feel genuinely distressed when our climate control systems fail, and we experience temperatures that our ancestors would have considered pleasantly mild. But beneath this veneer of modern fragility lies something profound and largely untested. The same genetic programming that enabled Ice Age hunters to track mammoth herds across frozen wastelands still exists in your DNA. The pattern recognition abilities that helped Egyptian workers identify deadly parasites in Nile water remain embedded in your neural architecture. The rapid threat assessment skills that kept Roman citizens alive in urban death traps are still part of your cognitive inheritance. The question that haunts every honest examination of historical survival is this: what would happen if the modern safety nets suddenly disappeared? If the power grids failed permanently? If supply chains collapsed completely? If social institutions crumbled beyond repair? Would you discover that you're stronger than you ever imagined? Or would you join the statistical majority who historically didn't survive when civilization broke down? Consider the psychological profile of someone reading these words right now. You've made it through this entire journey without turning away, which suggests you possess at least some of the morbid curiosity and intellectual courage that characterized historical survivors. You're willing to confront uncomfortable truths about human mortality and suffering, rather than retreating into comfortable illusions about safety and predictability. That willingness to face harsh realities head-on was one of the defining characteristics of people who survived when others didn't. Historical survivors weren't necessarily optimists. They were realists who could look directly at terrible situations and still find ways to keep fighting. They could watch their children die from diseases they couldn't cure and still maintain the motivation to protect their remaining family members. They could endure physical pain that would send modern people to emergency rooms and still perform the essential tasks that kept their communities alive. They could witness unspeakable violence and still trust enough to form the social bonds that made group survival possible. They could experience repeated devastating losses and still believe that tomorrow might be better than today. But here's where the analysis becomes truly disturbing. The very qualities that make you successful in modern life might be the biggest obstacles to survival in historical contexts. Your ability to specialize in narrow professional skills, your expectation that experts will handle dangerous situations, your reliance on complex technological systems, your assumption that institutions will provide safety and support, and every one of these adaptive strategies for modern life would become potentially fatal vulnerabilities if you were suddenly transported to a historical survival scenario. Your specialized knowledge would be largely useless. The experts you depend on wouldn't exist. The technological systems you rely on would be completely absent. The institutions you trust for protection would be non-existent or actively hostile. The learning curve for transitioning from modern life to historical survival would be so steep that most people would die during the adaptation period before they had a chance to develop essential survival skills. You would have to simultaneously unlearn modern dependencies while acquiring completely new capabilities, all while dealing with immediate threats that could kill you if you made the wrong decision. Your modern brain has been optimized for processing abstract information, managing complex social relationships, and operating technological interfaces. But could you rapidly develop the pattern recognition skills needed to track dangerous animals through unfamiliar terrain? Could you learn to read weather signs well enough to predict storms that could kill you if you were caught unprepared? The physical conditioning required for historical survival would challenge even modern people who consider themselves athletically fit. The cardiovascular endurance needed for Ice Age hunting involved sustained exertion at high intensity levels while carrying heavy equipment across difficult terrain. The muscular strength required for Egyptian construction work involved lifting and moving massive stones without mechanical assistance for hours at a time. Roman urban survival demanded the agility and coordination needed to navigate crowded, dangerous streets while avoiding multiple simultaneous threats. Medieval survival required the stamina to perform manual labor from dawn to dusk while maintaining alertness for potential attacks, accidents, or other emergencies that could occur without warning. But the physical challenges pale in comparison to the psychological adaptations that would be required. Historical survival demanded tolerance for uncertainty that would drive most modern people to nervous breakdowns within weeks. You would have to make crucial decisions about resource allocation, social relationships, and personal safety based on incomplete information and unreliable sources. The emotional resilience required for historical survival involved processing trauma and loss at levels that would overwhelm contemporary mental health systems. You would have to continue functioning effectively while grieving for people you couldn't save, dealing with chronic pain from injuries you couldn't treat properly, and living with constant awareness that death could come at any moment from countless different sources. Historical survivors developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to compartmentalize emotional pain while maintaining focus on immediate survival needs. They learned to form meaningful relationships, despite knowing that future losses were statistically inevitable. They found ways to experience joy and satisfaction even while living under conditions that would be considered intolerable by modern standards. The moral flexibility required for historical survival would challenge contemporary ethical frameworks in ways that could cause severe psychological distress. You would have to participate in or accept practices that violate modern moral standards while maintaining enough personal integrity to function as a trustworthy member of your survival group. Resource scarcity in historical contexts often forced impossible choices about who received food, medical care, and protection when there wasn't enough for everyone. You would have to make these decisions while understanding that choosing to save one person might mean allowing another person to die, and that the person who died might be someone you cared about deeply. The social dynamics of historical survival required navigating complex hierarchies and power structures that could change rapidly based on circumstances beyond your control. You would need to understand when to assert yourself and when to submit, when to share resources and when to hoard them, when to trust others and when to protect yourself from potential betrayal. Historical survival often required forming alliances with people you might not like or trust, while maintaining enough distance to protect yourself if those alliances became dangerous. You would have to evaluate potential partners based on their practical skills and reliability under stress, rather than personal compatibility or shared values. The time management skills required for historical survival would be completely different from contemporary approaches to scheduling and productivity. You would have to balance immediate needs for safety and resources with longer-term strategies for establishing security and improving your living conditions, all while operating under uncertainty about future circumstances. Historical survivors had to maintain awareness of multiple time horizons simultaneously. They needed to respond to immediate threats that required split-second decision-making while also planning for seasonal changes that affected food availability, weather conditions, and social dynamics. They had to prepare for potential disasters that might occur years in the future, while managing daily challenges that demanded constant attention. Your modern lifestyle has created dependencies that would become severe vulnerabilities in historical contexts. Reliance on processed foods would leave you unprepared for the foraging, hunting, and food preparation skills that were essential for historical survival. Dependence on climate-controlled environments would leave you vulnerable to weather conditions that historical people considered normal. Addiction to artificial lighting would leave you struggling to adapt to natural day and night cycles that determined when historical activities could be safely performed. Reliance on electronic communication would leave you without the face-to-face social skills that were essential for forming survival alliances and navigating complex group dynamics. Medical dependencies would create immediate life-threatening situations for many contemporary people attempting historical survival. Prescription medications for chronic conditions wouldn't be available, forcing people to manage serious health problems without effective treatments. Even minor medical issues that are easily addressed today could become major survival challenges in historical contexts without modern medical intervention. The sleep patterns required for historical survival would challenge modern people who are accustomed to regular schedules and comfortable sleeping conditions. Historical survival often required irregular sleep based on threats, opportunities, and environmental conditions rather than consistent daily routines. Guard duties, hunting activities, and emergency responses meant that you would have to function effectively despite chronic sleep deprivation. Food acquisition in historical contexts would require knowledge and skills that most modern people lack entirely. You would need to learn hunting techniques, foraging skills, food preservation methods, and cooking with primitive tools, all while competing with other people and animals for limited resources. Mistakes in food acquisition or preparation could result in starvation, poisoning, or conflicts that reduced your survival chances. Water safety would be crucial for historical survival, but completely foreign to modern people accustomed to treated municipal supplies. You would need to identify safe water sources, recognize contamination signs, and treat water to reduce disease risks, using methods that required practical experience and could mean the difference between health and potentially fatal illness. Toolmaking and maintenance would be essential for historical survival, but completely absent from modern education and experience. You would need to create weapons, implements, and household items from raw materials, while also learning to repair and modify tools using available resources. The ability to maintain essential equipment could determine whether you could continue performing survival tasks. Navigation skills required for historical survival would extend far beyond modern GPS dependencies. You would need to navigate using natural landmarks, celestial observations, and environmental cues while understanding seasonal changes, weather patterns, and geographic hazards. Getting lost in historical contexts could easily mean death from exposure, starvation, or dangerous encounters. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of historical survival would be the psychological transition from modern assumptions about safety and predictability to historical realities where death was always close and survival was never guaranteed. You would have to abandon the mental frameworks that make modern life manageable, while developing entirely new approaches to risk assessment and decision-making. The people who survived history's deadliest eras possess psychological qualities that enable them to function effectively under conditions that would incapacitate most modern individuals. They had tolerance for uncertainty that allowed them to make important decisions without complete information. They had emotional resilience that enabled them to continue fighting for survival despite repeated devastating losses. They had social intelligence that helped them navigate complex group dynamics while forming the alliances necessary for mutual protection and resource sharing. They had physical courage that allowed them to face immediate dangers when retreat wasn't possible. They had mental flexibility that enabled them to adapt their strategies when circumstances changed rapidly. Most importantly, they had something that modern people rarely need to develop: the absolute conviction that survival was worth whatever sacrifices and compromises it required. They understood that life itself was precious enough to justify enduring pain, making difficult choices, and fighting against overwhelming odds when surrender would mean death. As we reach the end of our journey through history's deadliest eras, the ultimate question isn't whether you could survive these impossible conditions. The ultimate question is whether understanding these historical realities changes how you think about your own life, your own challenges, and your own capacity for resilience when circumstances demand it. Every comfortable moment you experience today exists because people who came before you refused to give up when giving up would have been easier than continuing to fight. Every modern convenience, every medical breakthrough, Every social institution that provides security represents the accumulated achievements of countless individuals who survived when survival seemed impossible. Their legacy isn't just the world they built for future generations. Their legacy is the proof that human beings possess remarkable capacity for endurance, adaptation, and survival when circumstances require it. The same potential that enabled them to overcome history's deadliest challenges remains embedded in human nature, waiting to be discovered when it's needed. The next time you face difficulties that seem overwhelming, remember that you carry within yourself the genetic and cultural inheritance of people who survived ice ages, plagues, famines, wars, and social collapses that claimed the majority of their contemporaries. Their strength lives on in your DNA, their wisdom survives in accumulated human knowledge, and their courage remains available to anyone willing to access it. But most importantly, their story reminds us that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about maintaining hope when hope seems irrational, finding meaning when existence seems meaningless, and continuing to fight for better futures when the present seems unbearable. That's the real lesson from history's deadliest eras, and it's a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was 24,000 years ago, when our ancestors first decided that humanity was worth saving. The question isn't whether you would survive history's deadliest eras. The question is whether you'll live your modern life with the same courage, determination, and appreciation for existence that enabled our ancestors to survive so that you could be here today. Their greatest victory wasn't just staying alive. Their greatest victory was ensuring that the human story would continue, that future generations would have the opportunity to build better worlds, and that the struggles they endured would ultimately lead to something greater than mere survival. That something greater is your life, right now, in this moment. Every breath you take, every choice you make, every challenge you overcome is part of their continuing legacy. The deadliest eras in human history are behind us, but the human capacity for survival, growth, and transcendence remains as powerful today as it was when our ancestors first looked up at Ice Age stars and decided that tomorrow was worth fighting for. So would you survive the most dangerous eras in history? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe, but you're surviving today, and that's what matters, because today is your era, your test, your opportunity to honor the legacy of those who came before by living with the same courage and determination that carried humanity through its darkest hours into the light of whatever comes next. The story continues, and now it's your chapter to write. The fascinating thing about human survival isn't just the physical adaptations we've discussed. It's the psychological programming that gets activated when everything familiar disappears. Your modern brain carries ancient software that most people never know they possess until circumstances force it online. Consider what happens in contemporary disaster scenarios when normal social structures collapse temporarily. Hurricane survivors who've never hunted in their lives suddenly develop the ability to track and catch small game. Urban office workers discover they can identify edible plants and construct weatherproof shelters using nothing but debris and intuition. People who've never been in physical fights find themselves capable of defending their families with a ferocity that surprises everyone, including themselves. These aren't learned behaviors. They're genetic memories awakening under pressure, ancient programming reasserting itself when modern systems fail. The same neural pathways that helped your Ice Age ancestors survive mammoth hunts remain intact in your brain, just waiting for the right trigger to activate them. But here's where it gets truly interesting. The triggers that activate these survival systems in modern people aren't necessarily the obvious ones you might expect. It's not always life-threatening situations that bring out historical survival instincts. Sometimes it's prolonged uncertainty, resource scarcity, or social isolation that flips the switch between modern thinking and ancient survival mode. Research on prisoners of war, shipwreck survivors, and people trapped in natural disasters reveals consistent patterns in how modern humans rediscover their ancestral capabilities. The initial shock period, where people rely on modern assumptions and wait for rescue, typically lasts between 3 and 7 days. After that threshold, something fundamental changes in human psychology. The transformation isn't gradual, it's more like a switch being thrown. People stop thinking about comfort and start thinking about calories. They stop worrying about social etiquette and start evaluating everyone around them as potential allies or threats. They stop planning for abstract future goals and start focusing on the immediate requirements for staying alive through the next 24 hours. Modern people who've experienced this psychological shift describe it as simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Terrifying because they discover capabilities within themselves that feel alien and disturbing. Exhilarating because they realize they're far more resourceful and resilient than they ever imagined possible. The sensory changes alone are remarkable. People report that their vision becomes sharper, their hearing more acute, and their sense of smell dramatically enhanced. They notice details in their environment that were completely invisible before the survival programming activated. They can detect subtle changes in weather patterns, identify potential food sources, and assess threats with accuracy that seems almost supernatural. But the most profound changes occur in social dynamics and decision-making processes. Modern people who activate survival mode describe a complete transformation in how they evaluate other human beings. Personal compatibility, shared interests, and emotional connections become secondary considerations. What matters is practical competence, reliability under stress, and willingness to contribute to group survival. The moral frameworks that guide modern decision-making also undergo dramatic shifts when survival programming takes over. Abstract ethical principles give way to practical calculations about resource allocation and group welfare. People who would never consider violence in normal circumstances find themselves capable of aggressive action when it's necessary to protect essential resources or defend against threats. These psychological transformations aren't permanent personality changes. They're temporary adaptations that reverse when normal conditions return. But the experience of discovering these hidden capabilities permanently changes how people understand themselves and their relationship to the world around them. The implications for understanding historical survival are profound. The people who lived through ice ages, plagues, famines, and wars weren't fundamentally different from modern humans. They were ordinary people whose survival programming had been activated by circumstances that demanded it. The psychological and physical capabilities that kept them alive exist within every contemporary person, dormant but intact. What makes historical survival so difficult to imagine isn't that our ancestors possessed special qualities we've lost. It's that we've never experienced the conditions that would activate our own survival systems. We've created a world so safe and predictable that most people live their entire lives without discovering what they're truly capable of when everything depends on it. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation of human survival capabilities. Skeletal remains from historical periods show that people who lived longest weren't necessarily the largest or strongest members of their communities. They were often average-sized individuals who showed evidence of healed injuries, indicating they survived multiple dangerous encounters through intelligence and adaptability rather than physical dominance. Tool caches and living sites from historical periods reveal sophisticated problem-solving abilities that modern people demonstrate only when forced by circumstances. Ice Age hunting equipment shows engineering principles that contemporary hunters rediscover independently when they're forced to create weapons from available materials. Egyptian irrigation systems demonstrate hydraulic understanding that modern engineers recognize as fundamentally sound. Medieval agricultural techniques reveal ecological knowledge that contemporary farmers develop when they're forced to work without modern chemicals and machinery. Roman urban planning shows crowd management and resource distribution strategies that modern disaster response teams implement during major emergencies. The consistency across different historical periods and geographic locations suggests that these capabilities aren't culturally specific knowledge that has to be learned and transmitted. They're innate human potentials that emerge reliably when circumstances require them. The same problem-solving approaches, social organization patterns, and resource management strategies appear independently whenever groups of people face similar survival challenges. This has profound implications for understanding your own survival potential in historical contexts. The question isn't whether you could learn the specific skills and knowledge that historical people possessed. The question is whether you could activate the psychological and social systems that would enable you to develop those capabilities when you needed them. Modern psychological research suggests that most people possess this capacity, but rarely access it because contemporary life doesn't provide the triggers necessary for activation. The safety and predictability of modern existence actually prevent the development of survival capabilities that remain latent within normal human psychology. But certain contemporary experiences do provide glimpses of these hidden potentials. Extended wilderness experiences, particularly when they involve some degree of genuine risk and self-reliance, can temporarily activate survival programming. Military training, especially in harsh environments, can trigger some of the same psychological adaptations that characterized historical survivors. Natural disasters and other emergency situations often reveal survival capabilities that surprise both the people who demonstrate them and the observers who witness them. Ordinary individuals suddenly display leadership abilities, physical endurance, and decision-making skills that seem to come from nowhere, but actually represent the activation of dormant survival systems. The most revealing experiences are those that involve prolonged uncertainty and resource scarcity without immediate rescue options. When people are forced to rely entirely on their own capabilities for extended periods, they consistently rediscover abilities that they never knew they possessed. The transformation typically follows predictable patterns, regardless of the individual's backgrounds or previous experience. First comes the recognition that normal social rules and expectations don't apply to survival situations. People stop worrying about politeness, fairness, and other social conventions that become irrelevant when basic needs aren't being met. This psychological shift often feels uncomfortable because it conflicts with deeply ingrained modern values, but it's essential for accessing survival capabilities. Next comes the development of enhanced environmental awareness and pattern recognition. People begin noticing details about weather, terrain, plant and animal behavior, and resource availability that were completely invisible to them under normal circumstances. This isn't learned knowledge. It's the activation of sensory and cognitive systems that exist within normal human neurology, but remain dormant in safe environments. The social dynamics shift toward pragmatic cooperation based on mutual benefit rather than emotional connection or cultural compatibility. People form alliances with individuals who contribute to group survival regardless of whether they personally like or trust them. Leadership naturally emerges based on competence and reliability rather than charisma or formal authority. Resource management becomes extremely sophisticated as people develop intuitive understanding of conservation, allocation, and strategic planning that extends far beyond their previous experience. They begin thinking in terms of energy expenditure, caloric return, and a risk assessment with precision that would impress professional analysts. The decision-making processes become remarkably efficient as people learn to evaluate options quickly, based on survival outcomes rather than emotional preferences or abstract principles. They develop tolerance for uncertainty and willingness to act on incomplete information that would paralyze them under normal circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, people discover reserves of physical and psychological endurance that far exceed anything they believe themselves capable of. They find they can function effectively despite hunger, exhaustion, pain, and emotional stress that would have incapacitated them in normal circumstances. These transformations occur reliably in modern people who face genuine survival challenges, suggesting that the capabilities demonstrated by historical survivors weren't unique to previous eras. They were normal human potentials that became necessary for survival under the conditions that characterized most of human history. The tragic irony is that the same technological and social advances that make modern life safe and comfortable also prevent most people from discovering their full capabilities. We've created environments so secure that the survival systems developed over millions of years of human evolution remain permanently dormant in most individuals. This creates a paradoxical situation where modern humans are simultaneously more capable and less capable than their historical ancestors. More capable because we have access to vastly superior tools, knowledge, and resources. Less capable because we've never activated the psychological and social systems that would enable us to use our advantages effectively under survival conditions. The question of whether you could survive history's deadliest eras ultimately depends on your ability to undergo the psychological transformation that would activate dormant survival capabilities. The physical skills, knowledge, and social adaptations would follow naturally once the underlying systems came online. But the transformation itself requires experiencing conditions that trigger survival programming. Most modern people will never face circumstances severe enough to activate these systems, which means they'll never discover what they're truly capable of when everything depends on it. This might seem like a disadvantage, but it's actually the greatest victory in human history. We've succeeded so completely at creating safe environments that survival capabilities are no longer necessary for most people most of the time. The legacy of historical survivors isn't just that they stayed alive under impossible conditions. Their legacy is that they fought and sacrificed to create a world where future generations wouldn't need to activate survival mode just to make it through another day. They endured so that you could live without having to discover your own capacity for endurance. But their capabilities remain within you, waiting in the genetic code they passed down through generations of survival against impossible odds. Whether you could survive history's deadliest eras isn't really about your current knowledge or abilities. It's about whether you carry within yourself the same fundamental human potential that enabled our ancestors to overcome every challenge history threw at them. The answer is yes, you do carry that potential. The question is whether you'll ever need to discover it, and whether humanity will continue succeeding at creating worlds where survival mode remains safely dormant for future generations who will face challenges we can't yet imagine. Their survival made your existence possible. Your survival will determine what possibilities exist for those who come after you. The story continues, and the ending isn't written yet. But as we close this journey through humanity's darkest chapters, remember that you're living proof that the human survival instinct works. Every breath you take, every choice you make, every challenge you overcome demonstrates that the same force that carried our ancestors through ice ages and plagues remains alive and active in the world today. The deadliest eras in history tested human limits and proved that those limits are far higher than most people ever imagine. Your era is testing different limits, but the fundamental human capacity for survival, adaptation, and transcendence remains as powerful now as it was 24,000 years ago. Would you survive the most dangerous eras in history? The honest answer is that you're already surviving. You're already overcoming challenges, making difficult decisions, and fighting for futures that may never come to pass. You're already demonstrating the same essential human qualities that enabled our ancestors to transform a hostile world into something approaching paradise. The survival continues, the story goes on, and somewhere in the future, people will look back at your era and wonder how anyone managed to survive the challenges you're facing right now. They'll carry your legacy in their genes and your achievements in their world, just as you carry the legacy of everyone who fought and died to make your existence possible. The most dangerous eras in history are behind us. The most important era in history is happening right now, and you're not just surviving it, you're writing it. The question that haunts every person who has ever wondered about their own survival instincts is this: what separates those who lived from the countless millions who perished in humanity's deadliest eras? As we've journeyed through ice ages that froze entire continents, ancient civilizations where paradise masked deadly perils, imperial grandeur built on foundations of urban horror, and medieval darkness where death stalked every street corner, one truth becomes undeniably clear. Survival in these periods wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It was about making the right choices at the right moments, often with incomplete information and under extreme pressure. The people who lived long enough to become our ancestors possessed something that transcended physical strength or intelligence. They had an almost supernatural ability to assess danger, adapt to changing circumstances, and make split-second decisions that meant the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming another statistic in history's brutal ledger. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. The very qualities that enabled survival in these deadly eras are still buried deep within your DNA. The genetic legacy of Ice Age hunters who stalked mammoths, Egyptian workers who dodged crocodiles, Roman citizens who navigated urban death traps, and medieval survivors who endured humanity's darkest chapter lives on in every cell of your body. The question isn't whether you have these survival instincts. The question is whether you could access them when your life depended on it. Consider the psychological profiles of people who survived each era. Ice Age survivors had to maintain absolute focus during hunts that could last for days, where a single moment of inattention meant death for themselves and starvation for their entire tribe. They developed pattern recognition skills that allowed them to track animals across vast distances, predict weather changes that could kill them within hours, and coordinate complex group activities without modern communication systems. These weren't casual abilities that developed over comfortable lifetimes. They were survival skills forged in conditions so harsh that failure meant immediate extinction. Every Ice Age survivor had watched friends and family members die from exposure, starvation, and predator attacks. They had personally experienced the terror of being stalked by cave bears and saber-toothed cats that viewed humans as potential prey rather than apex predators. The mental toughness required to function effectively under these conditions is almost incomprehensible to modern minds accustomed to safety and comfort. Ice Age humans had to make life or death decisions while exhausted from malnutrition, suffering from injuries that would require emergency medical attention today, and operating in social groups where personality conflicts could doom entire communities to extinction. Egyptian survivors developed different but equally remarkable psychological adaptations. They learned to live with constant awareness of invisible threats that could kill them slowly or quickly, depending on their daily choices. Every trip to the Nile carried the possibility of crocodile or hippo attacks, parasitic infections that would destroy their internal organs, or waterborne diseases that could kill them within days. The Egyptians who lived longest were those who could balance calculated risks with necessary activities. They had to collect water, fish, farm, and transport goods along the river while maintaining constant vigilance for threats that could emerge without warning. This required a form of situational awareness that modern people rarely develop, even in dangerous professions like law enforcement or military service. Egyptian survivors also had to navigate complex social hierarchies, where political changes could mean the difference between prosperity and death. They learned to read social cues that indicated shifting power structures, impending violence, or opportunities for advancement that could improve their survival odds. The psychological flexibility required to adapt to new rulers, changing economic conditions, and evolving social expectations while maintaining personal safety was extraordinary. Roman survivors faced perhaps the most complex psychological challenges of any historical period. They had to function effectively in urban environments where multiple deadly threats operated simultaneously. The Romans who lived longest were those who could assess and respond to immediate physical dangers like fires, floods, and building collapses, while also managing longer-term threats like disease, political violence, and economic instability. Roman urban survival required sophisticated risk management skills that involved constantly balancing competing priorities. Should you seek medical treatment for an injury and risk death from primitive surgical procedures, or endure pain and potential disability while hoping for natural healing? Should you invest in better housing that might protect you from fires, but also make you a target for robbery and political persecution? The Romans who survived these daily dilemmas developed decision-making processes that incorporated multiple variables and potential outcomes in ways that modern people rarely experience. They had to become experts in human psychology, understanding how crowds behave during emergencies, how political changes affected personal safety, and how economic fluctuations created opportunities or dangers for different social classes. Medieval survivors required perhaps the most diverse psychological skill set of any historical period. They had to navigate a world where violence was endemic, medical treatment was often fatal, food safety was constantly questionable, and social institutions provided minimal protection for ordinary people. The medieval period demanded psychological resilience that could withstand repeated trauma, loss, and disappointment, while maintaining the motivation to continue fighting for survival. Medieval survivors developed extraordinary tolerance for uncertainty and discomfort. They learned to function effectively while hungry, cold, injured, and emotionally devastated by the deaths of family members and friends. They had to make important decisions about resource allocation, social relationships, and personal safety while operating under conditions of chronic stress that would disable most modern individuals. The psychological adaptation that enabled medieval survival involved accepting that life was fundamentally dangerous and unpredictable, while still maintaining hope and motivation for continued existence. This required a form of mental compartmentalization that allowed people to experience joy, love, and satisfaction, even while living with constant awareness of mortality and suffering. Now here's the crucial question that determines whether you would survive these historical periods. Do you possess the psychological flexibility to adapt your modern mindset to historical realities? Most people today have been conditioned to expect safety, comfort, and predictability in ways that would be completely maladaptive in dangerous historical environments. Modern humans often struggle with relatively minor inconveniences like traffic delays, internet outages, or uncomfortable temperatures. We seek immediate solutions to problems and become frustrated when circumstances don't meet our expectations. These psychological patterns would be fatal in historical contexts where patience, endurance, and acceptance of discomfort were essential survival skills. The people who would be most likely to survive dangerous historical periods are those who already demonstrate psychological resilience in modern contexts. These are individuals who remain calm during emergencies, who can function effectively under stress, who adapt quickly to changing circumstances, and who maintain focus on long-term survival rather than immediate comfort. But psychological adaptability alone wouldn't be enough to ensure survival in history's deadliest eras. You would also need to rapidly acquire practical skills that modern education systems don't teach. Ice Age survival required detailed knowledge of animal behavior, weather patterns, tool making, food preservation, and group coordination under extreme conditions. Egyptian survival demanded understanding of water safety, disease recognition, agricultural techniques, construction skills, and navigation in both urban and desert environments. Roman survival required knowledge of urban hazards, basic medical care, food safety, political awareness, and emergency response procedures for fires, floods, and building collapses. Medieval survival involved the most comprehensive skill set of any historical period. You would need to understand agriculture, food preservation, basic medical treatment, weapon use, construction techniques, social protocols, legal systems, and survival strategies for various types of emergencies and disasters. The learning curve for acquiring these skills would be incredibly steep, and you would have to master them while dealing with the physical and psychological stresses of actually living in these dangerous environments. There would be no practice runs or safe learning environments where you could make mistakes without fatal consequences. Your modern advantages and disadvantages would create a complex survival profile that would be difficult to predict. Modern humans have better nutrition, education, and understanding of basic scientific principles that could provide significant advantages in historical contexts. You understand concepts like infection control, the importance of clean water, and basic first aid that could dramatically improve your survival odds. However, modern humans also have physical and psychological dependencies that would be severe disadvantages in historical environments. Most modern people lack the physical strength and endurance that were essential for survival in earlier eras. We have become accustomed to processed foods, climate-controlled environments, and medical interventions that wouldn't be available in historical contexts. The psychological dependencies might be even more problematic than the physical ones. Modern humans are accustomed to entertainment, privacy, social validation, and emotional support systems that wouldn't exist in historical environments. The isolation, boredom, and emotional trauma of historical survival might be more difficult for modern people to endure than the physical hardships. Your survival odds would also depend heavily on which specific time period and location you found yourself in. Landing among a well-organized Ice Age tribe with established hunting territories and survival knowledge would give you much better chances than finding yourself alone in the wilderness during the harshest part of the glacial maximum. Arriving in ancient Egypt during a stable political period with good Nile flooding would be far preferable to appearing during times of drought, foreign invasion, or political chaos. Roman survival would depend enormously on your social status, location within the empire, and timing relative to major disasters like plagues, fires, or military conflicts. Medieval survival would be influenced by countless variables, including regional political stability, agricultural conditions, disease outbreaks, weather patterns, and local social structures. The difference between landing in a relatively prosperous medieval community during good harvest years versus arriving during times of famine, warfare, or plague outbreaks could easily determine whether you survived your first month or first week. The social integration challenges would be particularly difficult for modern people attempting to survive in historical contexts. Language barriers alone could be fatal if they prevented you from understanding warnings, instructions, or social expectations that were essential for safety. Cultural differences in behavior, dress, and social interactions could mark you as an outsider and create additional dangers from suspicious or hostile community members. Religious and superstitious beliefs in historical periods could create survival challenges that modern people would struggle to navigate. Demonstrating knowledge or behaviors that seemed supernatural or heretical could result in persecution, exile, or execution. Failing to participate appropriately in religious observances or social rituals could create social isolation that reduced your access to community protection and resources. So the brutal truth is this: you carry within yourself the same genetic code that enabled our ancestors to survive humanity's deadliest chapters, but accessing those capabilities would require dismantling everything that makes modern life comfortable. The Ice Age hunters, Egyptian workers, Roman citizens, and medieval survivors who became your ancestors weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people whose survival programming activated under extraordinary circumstances. Their legacy lives on in your DNA, waiting for conditions that will hopefully never come. Whether you could survive these historical nightmares isn't really the question. The question is whether you'll honor their memory by living with the same courage and determination that carried humanity through its darkest hours so you could exist today.